Good morning, everyone, and to some of you, good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are and from where you're joining us, whether on Facebook or on Zoom. A very warm welcome to this webinar. This event is organized by the Asian Peace and Reconciliation Council, the APRC. I'm Thessak Phongket-Kao. I'm the Secretary General to the APRC, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Could I say a few words about the APRC? The APRC is a non-governmental, non-profit organization comprising members, council members who are former leaders, policymakers, and thinkers from the region and beyond. Our mission is to promote conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and peace building through track 2 diplomacy and dialogue. We're also delighted to be co-organizing this webinar with the Chinese Thai Institute of Rangsit University, where we are right now. As you know, the topic of this webinar is the shifting geopolitical trends and their impact on ASEAN and the region. I think this is a very timely, a very important topic, a topic that is very widely discussed these days. Given the profound changes and the transformation that we've all have witnessed in the global and regional strategic landscape. Obviously, uppermost in our minds is the heightened and intensified competition, strategic competition between the United States and China. The contestation between the two great powers are being played out, is being played out in the Asia-Pacific region, or what is known now as the Indo-Pacific region. And this had led to alignment and realignment of relations among major powers and regional countries. China is asserting itself, expanding its influence under the Belt and Road Initiative. The United States is reasserting its primacy under the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. These shifting trends also come at a time when globalization is being questioned. The multilateral rules-based international order is being challenged. At the same time, COVID-19 is still very much with us with all its impact on lives and economies. COVID-19 has also added further uncertainties in terms of geopolitics and geoeconomics of the region. So, in the midst of these developments, including the situation, the very dire situation in Myanmar, ASEAN is confronted with serious challenges to its unity, its centrality, and relevance. ASEAN is forced to navigate through uncharted waters. And so this webinar provides us with an opportunity to have an in-depth discussion on these developments and the implications for ASEAN and for the regional order and what lies ahead. Today, we are very fortunate to have three very prominent speakers to share their thoughts and perspective with us. And may I briefly introduce our speakers, all of whom bring a wealth of experience in foreign policy and diplomacy. First is Professor Dr. Surakiart Sathirathai, former Deputy Prime Minister and former Foreign Minister, as well as former Finance Minister of Thailand. Dr. Surikiat is the chairman of the Asian Peace and Reconciliation Council. He was the Dean of the Faculty of Law of Chulalongkorn University. Dr. Surikiat is a member of the board of the Boao Forum for Asia, as well as a member of the Leaders for Peace Forum, chaired by former French Prime Minister Raphael Varane. We're also honored and delighted to welcome Professor Ambassador Kishore Mahbubani and Ambassador Scott Marcel. Ambassador Mahbubani is a very well-known and highly respected intellectual and thinker in the field of international affairs and diplomacy. He served twice as Singapore's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. And during Singapore's tenure as a member of the UN Security Council, Ambassador Mahbubani had the privilege of assuming the rotational chair of the Security Council. Ambassador Mahbubani was also the permanent secretary of Singapore's Foreign Ministry, the highest rank in the Korea Foreign Service. He is the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and he's also a very prolific writer, having authored a number of books on a wide range of topics in international relations and diplomacy, especially his most recent book, Has China Won? His books have become international bestsellers. He now serves as a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Ambassador Scott Marcel has vast experience in ASEAN affairs and relations between the US and ASEAN. He served as the US Ambassador to Indonesia and concurrently as US Ambassador to ASEAN. He also served as the US Ambassador to Myanmar. Before that, he was a Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific, overseeing the United States relations with Southeast Asia. Ambassador Marcel is currently a visiting scholar and fellow at Stanford University's Walter Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. Again, a very warm welcome to all our distinguished speakers. We will begin with opening remarks by each of the speakers for between 8 to 10 minutes. And after the first round of initial remarks, we will open the floor for this discussion and then a question and answer session with those in the audience. May I note that the webinar is being broadcast live through Zoom link and on the Facebook page of APRC and Rangsit University. Now, those who have questions or comments can post them through the chat function on the Zoom link or post them on Facebook Live. So without further ado, I would now like to give the floor to Professor Ambassador Kishore Mahbubani. Professor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sihasa. It's such a pleasure to reconnect with old friends like you, Dr. Surakiat, Hamed Alba, Jigmeet Lee, and also new friends like Scott Marcel. And I must say, I'm very happy to join a program hosted by APRC because one other thing I do nowadays is to head the Asian Peace Program at the National University of Singapore, and I hope that we'll have a chance to collaborate sometime with the APRC too. But today, I'm going to talk in some ways about the most dangerous geopolitical tension in the world today, because that's what we're supposed to address, shifting geopolitical trends. And there's absolutely no question that the geopolitical contests between the United States and China, which, as you mentioned, Ambassador Sihasa, is the subject of my book, Has China Won? There is absolutely no doubt that this contest will gain momentum in the next decade. And that's why I think the 2020s will be called the dangerous decade. So the goal of my remarks, therefore, and as you know, the thesis of my book, which is the paradoxical one, is that a major geopolitical contest between the United States and China is both inevitable and avoidable. So what I propose to do is to divide my remarks into three parts. In part one, I'll explain why it is inevitable, why we should put our seatbelts on. Number two, I'll also add that this contest, unfortunately, is also being fueled by serious misunderstandings by both sides. And then part three, I will try to suggest how it is avoidable. And frankly, I'm going to stress that ASEAN has a very important role to play to ensure that we don't get the worst consequences of this US-China contest. So that's a three-part structure of my remarks, and I'll stick to the time limit you gave me of 8 to 10 minutes. So part one, why is it inevitable? Well, the reason why it's inevitable is that it's driven by deep structural forces. And the first structural force is a law of geopolitics, which is almost like 2,000 years old, which is that whenever the world's number one emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's number one power, which today is the United States, the United States, the number one power, will always push down the world's number one emerging power. And this has been, Graham Allison of Harvard has documented this in his book, Destined for War. You see this case after case happening. But what is astonishing to me, having just spent 4 weeks in the United States in October, is the remarkable deep consensus in the American body politic that this is the time for the United States to stand up to China. And I can tell you that there are very, very few dissenting voices, And I find that interesting because the United States, the biggest strength of the United States as a society, as we know, it's a diversity of opinions. Everyone speaks what they want to speak. And indeed, frankly, even though the United States is deeply polarized today, there's a complete consensus on China. So it shows you the power of this structural force, that everybody is become part of it. But the second structural force, I'm just going to mention in passing, because international relations is not just driven by rational factors, it's also driven by emotional factors. And this first one, everyone talks about. The second one, no one except me, I think, talks about. And this emotional factor is what I call the fear of the yellow peril. And I want to emphasize this only to explain that there is so much emotion that you can witness in this US-China contest. And if you want to understand these emotions, you also got to understand this fear of the yellow peril has deep roots, and it surfaces from time to time in Western societies. And in the United States, for example, at the end of the 19th century, the United States Congress passed something called the Chinese Racial Exclusion Act. Now, I want to mention that point of history to illustrate that this has deep roots, this emotional factor. And the third structural force, by the way, which explains the bipartisan consensus in the United States on China, is this disappointment that after the United States engaged China economically, many Americans believed that China would then open up politically, become a liberal democracy like the United States, and United States and China would live happily ever after. Now, you may think such an expectation is a fairy tale, but I must say, in fact, the most senior official in the Biden administration in Asia today is Kurt Campbell. Please read his essay in the magazine Foreign Affairs, and Kurt documents how that was a bipartisan expectation in the US, and therefore explains the bipartisan consensus against China today. So these are the structural forces. Now, let me quickly deal with the misunderstandings. Now, the first misunderstanding, of course, is a follow-up on my previous point about the bipartisan disappointment. As Kurt records, both the Democrats and Republicans believe that when the United States engaged China, after more engagement, the United States would then open up China politically, and China would become like the United States. I can tell you this, by the way, if future historians look at this expectation, they'll be shocked. They'll say, how come a young republic like the United States, less than 250 years old, with 1/4 China's population, how did the United States expect that United States engagement with China would transform a 4,000-year civilization and make the 4,000-year civilization look like the United States? Even this expectation is strange, but there's a real expectation. But this is a misunderstanding. And I think many of us in Asia understand basically a very simple reality. China will be China. And 4,000 years of political tradition, history, culture, which favors a strongman rule in China, is not going to disappear overnight just because of the arrival of the United States on the political scene. And similarly, on the military front, there's also a major misunderstanding that when China becomes powerful, China will act militarily like the United States and have set up bases around the world, fight wars around the world. And, frankly, if you look at Henry Kissinger's book on China, which is an excellent book on China, he begins the book by talking about how the Chinese have this philosophy that the best way to win a war is by not fighting it. And so that's why China is the only major power, only permanent member of the UN Security Council that hasn't fought a war in 40 years, hasn't fired a bullet since the naval skirmish in Vietnam. So this misunderstanding of China is deep. So we, I think in ASEAN, need to speak out if we spot these kinds of misunderstandings. So all this brings me to part 3 of my comments about how do we avoid it. I think the best way to avoid it is we live in a small, interconnected, interdependent world where common global problems and common global challenges are becoming far more important. That's the message from COVID-19. That's also the message from climate change. And frankly, all 7.8 billion of us now live in a small planet in peril. We should all come together and focus on the common global challenges rather than our differences. Because if our planet is destroyed, humanity has no other planet to go to. Therefore, for that reason alone, I think it's important for the 6 billion people who live outside, there are 7.8 billion people in the world, 1.4 billion in China, 330 million in the United States. That's 6 billion people outside the rest of the world. It's very important for us 6 billion people to speak out calmly, rationally, to try and persuade the United States and China to at least press the pause button on this US-China contest and focus on our common challenges, take care of them before we do anything else. And in this regard, among the 6 billion people, I think the 650 million people in ASEAN have a special responsibility to speak out because we are closest to the scene. We are good friends with the United States. We are good friends with China. And we want to be good friends with the United States. We want to be good friends with China. So we, I think, therefore have a certain degree of moral responsibility to speak out on behalf of the rest of humanity. And I hope as a result of this forum today, Ambassador Sihasa, we will make a difference and get more ASEAN voices to speak up. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments, Professor Mahbubani. Yes, I think we all agree that it seems that this contest or competition strategically between the US and China seem inevitable. But I guess the challenge is how to make it avoidable, especially to prevent the competition from becoming an all-out conflict and confrontation. So on that note, I'd like to give the floor to Ambassador Scott Marcel for his perspective. Ambassador.
Thanks, Ambassador Siasak. Wow, Ambassador Mahbubani is a tough act to follow, but I guess I knew that coming in. I'm not sure I'm going to have the answer to how to solve all of this, but first let me begin by saying, Ambassador Siasak and others, thank you so much for inviting me to join this really distinguished panel on an extremely important topic. Seeing you all virtually out there makes me really miss Southeast Asia even more, and I look forward to being back and seeing you all in person soon. But the impact of changing geopolitics on ASEAN. The changing geopolitics, when I look at the news of the discussion on social media and in the press, there's a lot of focus these days on, U.S. free and open Indo-Pacific, the Quad, more recently AUKUS, some on BRI, etc. And these are all very important developments for sure that warrant a lot of discussion. Some of them have caused some concern in Southeast Asia. I think I understand why the concern. I think sometimes it's a little bit overstated. But to me, the fundamental geopolitical shift that we've seen over the last 20 to 30 years is, as Ambassador Mahbubani suggested, the rise of China. And I don't say that to blame China. Credit to China for being quite successful in developing so rapidly and gaining so much strength. But that is the shift in geopolitics over the last generation. And with that is the fact that I believe, my personal view, China in Southeast Asia seeks to have rather dominant influence, to minimize US and Western influence, certainly to take control of the South China Sea, even though many of its claims there don't seem to have any basis in international law. So there's some real concerns there. And again, I say that not to say all the blame rests in Beijing. I mean, it is a competition. And it's very important that it be handled very carefully. On that note, I think the meeting last week, the virtual meeting between President Biden and President Xi was very important. It didn't solve the problem. It didn't end the competition. But I went over listened to the readouts by the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and others very carefully. And I think it's clear that I'll just speak in this case, on the US side. I don't want to try to speak for China, but I think it's pretty clear that there's a desire to keep the dialogue open. And as President Biden put it, find a way to put guardrails up in this competition so that it can be managed in a way that reduces the risks of serious problems or things even turning into conflict. So I expect that we'll see more efforts like this to not end the competition, but to manage it in a way that reduces risks and hopefully reduces anxiety, including in Southeast Asia. The impact of this on Southeast Asia, and again, I recognize I'm the one American here in a virtual room full of people who've grown up and lived their whole lives in Southeast Asia, but I've spent enough time there to understand that, in ASEAN, Southeast Asia, there's great concern about being sort of the battleground between the big powers. Great concern about foreign big powers meddling in Southeast Asian affairs, and hence the desire for ASEAN to be able to address challenges in Southeast Asia, the importance of ASEAN centrality, for ASEAN to take the lead and be able to address issues as much as possible, in part to discourage big power meddling. I think whenever there's rising geopolitical tension or competition, as we see, when you see things, whether it's BRI or Quad or whatever, it's understandable that it creates a certain amount of nervousness in Southeast Asia. People are going to feel a little bit uncomfortable. And also the concern about being asked or forced to choose sides, which of course people in Southeast Asia and governments don't want to do, and frankly shouldn't have to do. So these are all really understandable concerns. And the question is what to do about it. Far be it from me to speak for ASEAN or any Southeast Asian government, but I think step one is for Southeast Asia and ASEAN as much as possible to strengthen itself, so that it is more resilient, better able to stand up and push back against problematic things, or as Ambassador Mahbubani suggested, play a prominent role in trying to, help ease tensions and guide this competition in a healthier way. The other point I would argue, and this is again, speaking very much from not as a US government official, from an American perspective. I think China's rise argues very much for the United States and Southeast Asia and ASEAN to redouble efforts to build stronger partnerships between the United States and Southeast Asia. And I want to be really clear here. When I say that, I don't mean building partnerships against China, not at all. Southeast Asian countries are going to and need to have good relations with China. That's a hugely important partner. So I take that as a given. What I'm talking about is a stronger and broader U.S. Southeast Asian relationship that's built on a positive agenda, on its own merits, not about China, but whether you're working together on trade and the economy, infrastructure, climate change, public health issues, transnational crime. There's so many issues we could work together on. We are working on those, but I think we can do more. And I think strategically, it's in the interest of both Southeast Asia and the United States to build that relationship, again, not against China, but on its own merits with a very positive agenda. And I think that's important both because of the benefits that flow from working together in these areas, but also because, in my view, a stronger U.S. Southeast Asia relationship gives all of Southeast Asia more freedom of maneuver, more maneuvering room, not against China, but to maintain full sovereignty and as much flexibility and space to operate in as possible. So that would be my final point on the implications of these shifting geopolitical trends for Southeast Asia and ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Yes, indeed. We were very pleased that the summit meeting took place, albeit virtual, between President Biden and President Xi. And as you said, the summit did not solve all the problems, but I hope that it put in place a process where there can be continued high-level dialogue to address some of these issues that stand in the way of the relationship. And I think the key word was safeguards, how to set up safeguards to prevent the relationship from becoming an all-out conflict. But I think the point that you made is very interesting about ASEAN helping to reduce tension between the United States and China. It's a very interesting point because ASEAN, as you know, is also facing challenges to its unity. And so this is a key point that ASEAN has to recognize that we do have a role to play. And so I'm sure that these are some of the points that we can discuss later. But now I'd like to give the floor to Professor Dr. Surukiat for his perspective.
Thank you very much, Permanent Secretary Sihasak, Ambassador Mahbubani, Ambassador Marcel, all colleagues. Thank you very much for joining us. I fully agree with the intervention by both of you that one of the causes of the tension is the rise of China, and that Southeast Asia and ASEAN has to get our act together, not against China, but to have a good relationship with China, with the United States, so that we'll be able to have their own interests in the region. And I agree with Ambassador Mahbubani that this is a big momentum, the contest between the two superpowers, and it will continue in the next decade. From Southeast Asia, from ASEAN, we have seen since the time of President Trump, and although it is not trade war, but it has continued to a certain extent, the trade, investment, competition, technology competition, which has become war. And the next would be the contest in the green economy and electric vehicle. The contest or competition to have increase of influence in Asia, contacts, visits, vaccine diplomacy, assistance in medical field. Some are very good ones, but it is seen as a clear competition between China and the United States. Competition or contest to find friends, newly created Quad Summit and Dialogue, G7, BRICS Bank, AIIB, Belt and Road Initiative, Build Back Better World, B3W, Community of Shared Future of Mankind. The latest is the Global Economic Development and Security, GERD, initiated by China, or what President Xi Jinping said in the UNGA last year on the big data for sustainable development goals. So all of these are good things, but they are considered as initiatives to compete between the world two superpowers. In addition to that, is also a competition on international norms and values. China has also announced lately that they have the policy to reinforce human rights standard. They will be joining the work of the Human Rights Council and Human Rights standard under the UN, under the United Nations. And I think Ambassador Mahbubani raised a very important point, and that's the issue of the public opinion. The public opinion in the West, especially in the United States, has been against China. That may include some of us, the yellow-skinned people as well, unfortunately. And the public opinion in China is not that positive about the Westerners, about the people in the United States either. So I think that's, we can spend more time on that, but I think I fully agree that this momentum is increasing in the next decade, and we have to live with it. So what is the ASEAN desirable situation? I fully agree with both of you that ASEAN is one of the key players in this particular region, and we have to get our act together to see what we can do. First of all, I think ASEAN would like to see the stable US-China relations. It is a key to security and development in Southeast Asia. And we feel that the United States and China should manage relationship, and they have to manage it well for the interests of both countries, the interests of the region, and for the world. ASEAN countries do not want to choose sides. And I think you are correct in saying that we will not choose sides. I think ASEAN wants ASEAN to be or continue stabilizing organization in Southeast Asia. We want to be a bridge between US and China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, European Union, and Russian Federation. We want to maintain the principle of ASEAN centrality that Ambassador Sihasak has alluded to at the outset, that we want to be in the driver's seat. We want to maintain the principle of ASEAN connectivity, that we connect with everyone in the world, physically and digitally. We want ASEAN to continue to be what I always call it, a just about right organization. It's an organization that all sides, all parties in the world have comfort level in being friends with. We can have normal relations with all parties in the world. We want to create a partnership with major powers in tackling major problems in ASEAN: pandemic, natural calamity, economic recovery after COVID-19, gross violation of human rights, problems in Myanmar, and so on and so forth. So that would be the desirable scenario for ASEAN. But then what are challenges for ASEAN? To be very frank, in this academic seminar, I think we lacked, we meaning ASEAN, coordinated effort to map out our collective strategy vis-a-vis superpowers. The consensus-based decision-making process, what former Minister Said Hamid Alba and we always refer to ASEAN as a step-by-step action organization. Okay, consensus-based decision-making process, and we do things step by step, and we call it the ASEAN way practice that has been with us over 50 years. But it seems to me that all of these characteristics, or what is dubbed as ASEAN way, do not help in providing platform for ASEAN common strategy towards superpower rivalries. I've observed that there's a decline of ASEAN proactive diplomacy. ASEAN way can be a part of ASEAN diplomacy. But again, as I said, but ASEAN way at present makes ASEAN unable to catch up with the fast changing world. We seem to lack key ingredients to make ASEAN way more effective. For example, I have observed in the past years the camaraderie among the foreign ministers of ASEAN or even leaders are not there in the same level that used to happen in the past. It's very rare that ASEAN would have new initiatives like Friends of the Chair to help the chairman of ASEAN doing 1, 2, 3. Our initiative on the Eminent Persons Group that in the past we have set up all the time to help giving guidelines to ASEAN leaders and foreign ministers on how to do things. And the Eminent Persons Group, we can always invite people from the United States, from Europe, and elsewhere, from Japan, to be joining us. We seem to lack collective action to resolve ASEAN's own problem of pollution of the haze, problem in Myanmar, and so on. And there's also a misunderstanding among ASEAN people and the international community of the ASEAN principle of non-interference, that we cannot talk about each other's affairs at all, which is not the case. There are so many issues that cease to be under the principle of non-interference. For example, the gross violation of human rights, or the gross violation of democracy, and so on and so forth. I think we also lack the ability in the past years to bring in superpowers, major powers, to help us resolve problems that ASEAN is facing. So I think these are all the challenges of ASEAN. So what do we need to do? I think we need to maintain that ASEAN to be the just about right organization, where all sides have comfort level of ASEAN. We can reach out to all camps, to all sides, to be working with us. Our structure is already very good, not too fortress-like in economic integration, not too loose, not too rigid as a security-oriented organization. We have to reinvigorate the role of ASEAN as a regional bridge, as a regional stabilizing organization. That role has to be enhanced. ASEAN way has functioned well in ASEAN, despite all the shortcomings I've alluded to. It has been ASEAN's strength. But this ASEAN strength at various juncture can become ASEAN weakness. But again, it is this particular weakness of ASEAN way that has tied 10 ASEAN countries together. Therefore, ASEAN way must be strengthened, must be rejuvenated, must be reinvigorated. New ideas, we should not underestimate the power or the thinking, the ideas from ASEAN. ASEAN has to be more forward-looking. ASEAN has to engage each other for a more strategic planning and to offer a third way approach to the world. So my conclusion, Ambassador Sihasak, at this point is that I agree that ASEAN has to play a role, and ASEAN can play a role. ASEAN way, if it is properly reinvigorated, can play a role to make ASEAN having a collective action, especially to deal with the rivalries among the superpowers. I have 3 questions before I finish this remark. One is, how can ASEAN navigate through superpower rivalries in the next decade? Can we really reinvigorate the ASEAN way approach? How ASEAN foreign ministers and leaders can put their heads together, put their act together, and look ahead and see that while we do not want to choose between the US and China, how can we help talk to both of them? We are not big, but we are not small. And we consist of countries with all spectrum of democracy and affiliation. 2, how can ASEAN be a future-ready ASEAN in the era of ever fast developing technology advancement, the new normal way of life after COVID-19, concern for green and blue economy, sustainable society? Is ASEAN ill-prepared for the global rapid changes? And my third question is how ASEAN can continue to be relevant in the fast changing international economic and political strategic landscape. If ASEAN Way cannot be properly reinvigorated, if ASEAN is doing in certain extent of what we are doing, not having so much initiative, not having collective power, cannot put our act together, then ASEAN would become irrelevant. And that is something that is not good for ASEAN. It's not good for the United States. It's not good for China. It's not good for major powers. I think both the US and China would like to see a stronger ASEAN. And I think it is also the responsibility of ASEAN. It rests upon ASEAN to look back and see what are our challenges and how can we overcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Dr. Surukit. Yes, I think, among the three speakers, one common theme is that we need a strong and vibrant ASEAN helping to build bridges between the two major powers and to cushion the competition that we see right now. And Dr. Surukit, you've raised three questions for us to ponder and to discuss. How can we reinvigorate ASEAN? The ASEAN way has been the key to our success, but today the ASEAN way has been the constraint to our further success. And indeed, we really have to revisit the principles and the way we have managed the cooperation within ASEAN. I think in the end, what's important is that ASEAN centrality means ASEAN must also be central within ASEAN and central to each and every member country. So I'd like to thank all the speakers for their insights and their perspective. And I'm sure that there are many points that we'd like to discuss. And to join me in the discussion, I have two colleagues, Ambassador Damrong Kraikhuan, who was our ambassador to Malaysia and Laos. He's joining us this morning on my right. And I also have Ambassador Pichayapan Chan Pumidon, who was our ambassador to Indonesia and Brazil. He's joining us as well. Both of them are Deputy Secretary General to the APRC. And we are also honored to have two very distinguished council members of the APRC joining us, former Prime Minister Bhutan, Excellency Tin Lee, and we have also the former Foreign Minister of Malaysia, Tan Sri Syed Hamid. Welcome, Excellency. So perhaps I'd like to give the floor to the two council members for their comments or question, perhaps beginning with former Prime Minister Tin Lee. Excellency, you have the floor. I think you're on mute now.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Mm-hmm. Firstly, I must admit my limitation arising from my not being an ASEAN citizen and therefore not being as well informed as I would need to be to give an opinion that would really matter on a subject or discussion, the question that we are dealing with. Let me simply say that I am deeply enlightened by the views expressed by the three speakers. I think each and every view that they have expressed are not only important, but absolutely relevant for us in considering and in dealing with the question of this very disturbing trend, and as Kishore has said, the most dangerous trend that the world is dealing with now. What I found particularly interesting was Kishore's observation, his comment, that much of this trend is stirred up not so much by reason, but by emotions. And I think it is relevant for us to consider as to whether it is only the countries themselves, the concerned parties themselves that are in fact ratcheting up this very negative emotions, or whether there are other parties aside from ASEAN that play a very important role. And I'm in particular referring to the international media. International media, which dominates international opinion, is one-sided. How do we deal with the international media in terms of how it can and it must influence a positive redirection of emotions, if at all there is need for continued emotion? And I think there is, but there needs to be the right emotions. Also, a question that I have is, one of the basis for stirring up this negative emotions and much of the Western perception of this, the danger, so-called danger from the rising of China is the moves that it has made, or its standing with respect to the South China Sea. I would like to get some views of the speakers on what they really feel about the freedom of navigation. Has the freedom of navigation across one of the most important maritime routes been really affected? And is that actually in danger? And what could be the core reasons and the basis for China's position on the South China Sea that does affect and concern all the members of the ASEAN? Lastly, I agree with my president, Surakiat, who says that the role of ASEAN is not to choose sides. It must not. I think it has a very powerful, positive role to play. It has the capacity to play a positive role. But I agree also that there is a need for dynamism in the way ASEAN deals with the very rapidly changing global scenario, the issues that it is confronted with affecting international relations, the situation in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency Thinley. I think you raised a very important issue at the heart of the strategic competition between the United States and China, and that is the South China Sea. Perhaps we could have some more discussion on the point that you raised about the freedom of navigation. I'd now like to give the floor to His Excellency Syed Hamid Tansi. You have the floor.
Hello, can you hear?
We can hear you.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you, Rasak, for inviting me, including me in this discussion. I think I feel very privileged and honored to participate and listen to our three distinguished speakers on a subject that I think for me is a very interesting subject. Professor Kishore Mahbubani and Scott Mitchell, my friend and colleague, Professor Dr. Surakiat. I think there is, all of us agree that there is definitely a shifting geopolitical trend. The only thing that we are trying to find ways, how do we participate in this changing political trend as ASEAN. And I think Kishore has laid out that it is inevitable between US and China, but it is avoidable. And at the same time, talking about ASEAN playing a role, that ASEAN must not stand at the side. And I think Surakyat and I myself agree with Professor Mahbubani's views. I agree with the Dr. Surakyat. And I think it is unavoidable that you will see China and US will be at a competition. I think the competition is not the problem. What we want to see is that this competition does not affect ASEAN adversely. And I think all of us speak about taking sides. I think it's a bit difficult in terms of politics for us not to take sides. We tend to take sides, whether we say so or not. We say that ASEAN should not take sides, but I think we do take sides. That's why people are seeing. I think at least the ASEAN masses and public is saying, not among the leaders, but the public is seeing that ASEAN is actually very divided when it comes to the US and China competition, when US and China tension. So I think it is important for us. I like to take what Professor Kishore Mahbubani says, that, all these things is inevitable, but we can avoid it. Why don't we find our common grounds? I think the very reason ASEAN was formed, if we look back, the very reason we were formed was because we do not want ASEAN to be a platform for big powers rivalry. We want to create a very peaceful zone in ASEAN where we can benefit from China's progress and development. We can benefit from the US position. So as far as I'm concerned, I think the best way, I consider that ASEAN is at present trying to find ways how it can move forward. And in trying to find the ways it can move forward, it is very careful. It has taken a very careful step. And I don't think we can get out of our tradition and custom of step-by-step ASEAN way to make sure that we do not hurt. We want to deal with all parties fairly and squarely. And I think but the most important thing is for the US to realize that, in my view, I'm not to say that I think the US is at fault, that ASEAN is in the region together with China. And I think the creation of, say, AUKUS, the creation of Indo-Pacific, and it is actually, whether we say so or not, is giving an indication that there is a competition that requires us to take sides. Which one do we feel comfortable? ASEAN feel comfortable to be in ASEAN, but at the same time, we want to play the role of being a bridge. And I don't think we would like to get into the competition that China with 4,000 years civilization, there is a structural change, and the US feels that the fear of the yellow peril and national and emotional factors. My own view is that in all diplomacy, there are two elements that is important. One is the rational element. Rational element, we make sure that we do things in a way that will not create tension or create conflict. The other one, we are driven mostly, even though we call it our national interest, we are driven by our emotions. The emotions in this particular case is driven by our desire to have a political identity, stronger growth. Within ASEAN itself, there is a greater growth of political identity, nationalism based on ethnicity or based on religion. So I think we are facing a very, very challenging time. I think what we can do insofar as we are concerned, what we can do in order to become the bridge for conflict avoidance, a bridge for creating a peaceful environment. How can we act collectively? One of the weaknesses of ASEAN is our inability on important political issues, because we are discussing geopolitical trends, transformation. We have not been able in political issues to act collectively or to have a common position. So in this way, ASEAN is not seen seriously, and yet we are still talking about ASEAN centrality. We are still talking about we want to be in the driver's seat. So we have a problem. So I would like to, as Asak has mentioned, and I think Surakiat also had mentioned, we need to revisit some of the issues. I think even our interpretation of non-interference, ASEAN from my time, Surakiat's time, we have moved from the traditional meaning of non-interference to a more accommodative concept of non-interference, that we have got an interest in things happening at the national borders of each other. So at least I think there is an opening up. And ASEAN is still interested in building its community building for the future. So I think I would go along and say that we need to see how ASEAN can be an important player. And I think most ASEAN countries, like I would like to see that we look at China, their position on ASEAN is more certain and clear. But we are facing problem with China because of its assertiveness. ASEAN is a major power now, militarily, economically, is playing a different role. But in the case of the US, my own view is that, I'm not taking the government view, my own view, the US tends to be very seasonal. US tend to be looking at situation, and at times they just abandon ASEAN. And then after ASEAN feel abandoned, I'm sorry, Scott, my Mr. Ambassador, but I feel that way. And then, whenever there is on the South China Sea, we talk about freedom of navigation. Freedom of navigation is accepted by everyone, but how do we define, interpret the freedom of navigation? So I still think that ASEAN is relevant. ASEAN must be willing to take its assertive role, that it must be willing to say that we are a collective group of 600 over million people. The difference can only be made if we act collectively. It is for our future that we should act collectively in order for us to play the role of peacemaker, peace builder. And in that regard, I think ASEAN will be better respected. And most importantly, in my conclusion is that ASEAN should be able to be seen as they are capable of solving their own internal and domestic issues or regional issues among themselves. So they must take the lead. I think the problem that we are having is within ASEAN, people are not seeing the leadership. As a group also, we are not showing that we are actually the leaders of the region that can make the difference in terms of relationship between US and China, that both must consider us to be the most important player when you are talking about reducing tension or overcoming tension. Thank you very much. Sorry for taking too much time. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Excellency. Yes, ASEAN needs to act collectively if we're going to play a constructive role in the region. But the point you raised, Excellency Syed Hamid, is very important. To be able to act collectively, we must be able to solve the internal problems within ASEAN. And that internal problem that we face right now, which we have not been able to solve, as you know, is the situation in Myanmar. And so I think that's a very important issue. But can I go back again to ask the views of the speakers on the relationship between the United States and China? I think we agree that it's all about perceptions or misperception. But going forward, what are the expectations of the United States on China? And what are the expectations of the China on the United States? And perhaps what are ASEAN expectations on the two major powers? Because I think what we expect is probably a more positive agenda from the two major powers. And so perhaps could I address this question to all the speakers going forward? What are the expectations? Because we really need both sides to arrive at a modus vivendi, a new equilibrium, as you know, so to speak, in the relationship. So this question is addressed to all the speakers. Yes, who would volunteer to go first? Ambassador Mahbubani?
Yes, you always need one idiot in the room to volunteer. So I'll volunteer and go first. Partly because, as you can tell from my book, I've thought about this subject. And the thing is, of course, I'm going to begin by emphasizing a key point, that the world was relieved that Joe Biden won the elections. I think the world would have been in a much tougher spot if President Donald Trump had won a second term. Because, in the last 9 months of the Trump administration, partly because President Trump was so angry with China over unleashing COVID-19, and so that personal anger meant that actually President Trump himself was restraining some of the hawks in the Trump administration, like Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, Pottinger. But in the last 9 months, Donald Trump was so angry with China, he unleashed all of them. And if you read the speech that Mike Pompeo gave in the Nixon Library, it was a very angry, negative speech on China, which is actually quite dangerous. And especially on one point, I think on Taiwan. And one word that has not been mentioned here is Taiwan. I think we do need to mention it, because if there's one issue that can actually start a nuclear war today, let's be clear, it is Taiwan. Because there are very hard red lines on the issue of Taiwan. And the reason everyone should know this is this, and this is one thing I did was to do a MOOC course on US-China relations, pointing out that the last living symbol of the century of humiliation that the Chinese suffered from 1842 to 1949 is Taiwan. And there's 100% consensus in China is that at some point in time, Taiwan must return to China. There's no rush if we keep the status quo. But if Taiwan moves towards independence, or is encouraged to move towards independence, as some people in the Trump administration tried to do, then that you cross the Chinese red line, and then China will declare war. And you can just imagine the consequences, right? And there won't be an all-out war with the United States and China. Counteraction. That's how you end up with a potential war. So for those of us who want peace in our region, it's important that we speak out, at least privately, on the Taiwan issue and point out that should be handled carefully. Now, the good news is that the Biden administration actually has been very good on this subject and has consistently said, I heard Vice President Kamala Harris in Singapore, I heard Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin speak in Singapore. Both of them reiterated the one China policy. And that's good. That helped to lower the temperature down on Taiwan. And I think in many ways, the meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping was also important in terms of lowering the temperature. But I want to emphasize one point, that even though the leaders may have good intentions, even though the officials may have good intentions, there are other forces at play, structural forces at play that are still creating tensions and conflicts. And it will be over some issue or the other on technology and so other areas. But that's why, frankly, we need to do more and we need to speak out more in ASEAN to help to lower the temperature all the time. Just one final comment. I want to agree with a key point that Ambassador Scott Marcial made, that there should be greater engagement between the United States and ASEAN. But I want to add that the most important engagement is trade. And here in the year 2000, United States trade with ASEAN was $135 billion, more than 3 times China's trade with ASEAN, which was $40 billion in the year 2000. By 2020, the United States trade has gone from 135 billion to 300 billion, an increase of 2.5 times. But China's trade with ASEAN had gone from 40 billion to 650 billion. And ASEAN is the #1 trading partner today of China, ahead of Europe and United States. So therefore, when the United States doesn't join the TPP, and with the RCEP, the 4 words we should actually emphasize is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, because that's creating a whole new economic ecosystem in our region. It's very important that the United States integrates itself into this new economic ecosystem, because that's how you preserve American influence in this region. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Marcel, would you care to address the question of expectation? I think.
Sure, I'll
Yes,
give it a
please.
shot. I would say first, I take the point that a few of you made about the emotions involved. I tend to think, just my personal view is that it may be more a little bit the reason for the competition may go back to Ambassador Mahbubani's first point of the 2 big powers, whether the existing superpower and the rising one. I think it's very hard not to have at least intense competition in that circumstance. There's certainly some emotion I would say in China as well as in the United States. It's not just in Washington on this, and that needs to be very carefully managed. I would note again that President Biden last week in the virtual meeting with President Xi did reiterate or reaffirm the one China policy, but also made the point that any change in Taiwan's status that wasn't done peacefully would be deeply concerning and problematic. In terms of expectations, I think, the South China Sea is a good example. The South China Sea is not a US-China issue. It's fundamentally an issue of China trying to use its intimidation and its maritime militia and stuff to assert de facto control over areas in which it has no basis in international law to control. It's not a matter of, oh, geez, China should have this island or has sovereignty over this island or that island. It's rather the means by which China is very clearly trying to use intimidation threat. I mean, just last week, right? Shooting water cannons at Philippine vessels that were resupplying the Philippine outpost at Second Thomas Shoal, which is very clearly in Philippines' exclusive economic zone. Malaysia has experience with this, Brunei, even Indonesia, although not a claimant with Natuna, you've got issues there. Vietnam, certainly. It's really showing its very assertive, very aggressive, very intimidating strategy to assert control. And I think that's really worrisome. It should be really worrisome to everybody. The United States has been very outspoken on it, and we've done a number of freedom of navigation operations and these sorts of things to continue to affirm the right of freedom of navigation for everybody. But I would argue that I know Southeast Asia and ASEAN has to be careful vis-a-vis China. I get that. But it's not so much being anti-China, but standing up for the principles. When any major power violates those principles, then I think ASEAN needs to speak out and take a stance. So I think, I wouldn't say the expectation, but maybe the hope in the United States is that China begins to more to follow some of these international rules, take this code of conduct negotiations seriously and try to achieve an outcome that would at least manage how this dispute is handled until there's a final negotiated settlement or whatever it may be. I think these are the sorts of things we look for. Taiwan, obviously, very concerning. Hong Kong. I was in Hong Kong in 1997. I was assigned there when China again became the sovereign. And what's happened there recently, I think, is very concerning. about China's intentions. It may not be geopolitics, but it says a lot about its commitments and its willingness to uphold or not those commitments. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ambassador Marcel. Yes, principles are very important, and ASEAN needs to stand by principles and its interests and not take side, which is going to be very difficult. But on this one, I'd like to ask Dr. Surakit to offer his views on the expectations of ASEAN with regard to the two major powers.
Thank you, Ambassador Sihasak. I will be very brief. I think ASEAN countries would like to see an increasing role of the United States in the region, but not the military role. We want to see the US political and economic role. So I agree with Kishore that for the US to come and have economic cooperation with ASEAN countries, CPTPP, and also the Free Trade Agreement of Asia and Pacific, FTAP, that is part of the discussion of APEC that Thailand will be the host starting this month, in fact. I think these are a clear indication that US is committed to engage Southeast Asian countries economically. It has been in the past the talk of more naval fleet shifted to Southeast Asia. I mean, security is important, but I think that ASEAN would like to see more economic engagement in Southeast Asia, especially in ASEAN, with individual country and also with ASEAN as a group. Secondly, I think the issue of pandemic and the issue of climate change is very important. And it seems to be the issue that both China and the US are heading towards cooperation, at least as it started in the COP26. So if the United States with technology advancement, with expertise, can provide technical assistance, dialogue with ASEAN on the climate change, the green economy, I think that's the way forward. Instead of US and China coming up with new initiatives, and with each new initiative, ASEAN has felt that we are forced to accept one or the other initiative. So in the past, we have decided to accept both initiatives at all times. And sometimes these two initiatives can be in conflict. But of course, we sort of middled through. So instead of coming up with a new initiative like Indo-Pacific or this or that, or China coming up with new initiative. So I think if we talk about substance as to what kind of economic activities United States can be engaging with ASEAN. For example, Thailand. All the top US headquarters companies are located in Bangkok, in Thailand. In the past, I was policy advisor to the former Prime Minister, General Chad Chai. We used to have Secretary of Commerce came to Thailand with a group of businessmen and met with the Federation of Thai Industry. They play golf together, having business matching and so on and so forth. That is something that is sort of lacking in the past. There used to be a video conference, and 20 years ago, video conference is really a big thing, with the USTR and the people who are interested in Thailand-US relationship, a dialogue, asking questions. That is also missing. So I think it is that type of cultural engagement, communication engagement, economic engagement that we would like to see more from the United States. And I think the United States may like to see ASEAN to stand by, or to be more assertive, to stand by principle of international concern. That is the non-use of violence in the case of Myanmar, no gross violation of human rights, democratic development. All of these are clearly spelled out in ASEAN Charter. So ASEAN countries should not be too shy in addressing these particular issues. Let me say something about South China Sea, because this is something that APRC, Asian Peace and Reconciliation Council, had been doing this job in the past. We used the quiet diplomacy, talking to leaders and foreign ministers of both claimant and non-claimant states, China and the rest of 10 ASEAN countries. Basically, we said that for the issue of overlapping area, in the South China Sea is very difficult. For the issue of sovereignty, sea boundary delimitation, no one can budge at each, is a nationalistic, patriotic issue right? So we said that why don't you look at an example between Thailand and Malaysia and also other third examples around the world. We have overlapping claims in the Gulf of Thailand, but 40 years ago, we agreed to enter into a joint development of oil and gas. Until now, the sea boundary delimitation in the Gulf of Thailand is not yet finished. We negotiated every year. If we were successful, we take off together. If we were not successful, we also take off. But we are very happy with the profit sharing. And if the 4 ASEAN countries and China can look at areas as part of the conflict avoidance, turning the conflict into cooperation in the South China Sea, they can work together. Starting from, say, marine environment research, joint tourism in the South China Sea, all the way to joint development area of oil and gas in the future. So I think so that the South China Sea issue is not a taboo. It's the area where cooperation can be launched as part of the conflict avoidance. And then with the joint tourism, joint maritime research, protection of the environment, all the way to development of oil and gas, we can also invite the United States, the European Union, Japan, and South Korea to join. We organized a workshop, the high-level workshop in Hong Kong once, and we invited the members of the private sector to join. And the members of the private sector to join, all from Asia, some from the United States as well, they said that they want to see the economic cooperation in South China Sea as part of the solution for the overlapping claim of sovereignty in the South China Sea. Because no one can budget it. That's why it's called the overlapping area. And if that is something that we can discuss, including the joint management of navigation route, that may be ambitious, but I think we can start for something very small. To make the long story short, now ASEAN and China has already started a joint working group on maritime research. But I hope that that can be elevated to the summit level to endorse it and to expand it into something more substantial. Thank you, Ambassador Sihasak.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Surkit. We have 2 more council members who are with us, and I'm sure that they would like to participate in the discussion. We have His Excellency, former Finance Minister of the Philippines, Lito Camacho, and we also have the former Secretary General of APRC, Sorajak Kasem Suwan. So I'd like to give the floor to either of them for their comments and questions. Dr. Sorajak, I think you have submitted a question. Please.
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador Sihasak. Before I ask my question, I like to further support the APRC chairman on the economic functional cooperation in the South China Sea. There was only about 2 weeks ago. There was a seminar in Haikou on cooperation in the South China Sea, and every speaker from China talk about functional cooperation in the South China Sea, especially now on the question of environmental cooperation. The symposium happens to be taking place at the same time as COP26. So everybody support that idea that China and ASEAN should cooperate on environmental issues in South China Sea as much as possible. So I agree with the APRC chairman that this is a way forward and it's something that needs to be done very quickly. My question is, in fact, would like to be addressed to Ambassador Marcel. I don't want to be provocative, but you mentioned earlier about the question that about the fact that the US wants to build a stronger relationship with ASEAN, not is for the benefit of mutual benefit of US and ASEAN, not to pressure ASEAN to take sides between China and the US. But wasn't Vice President Kamala Harris's message in her recent visit to Singapore and China with a strong China bashing message and a strong condemnation of China behavior in South China Sea, somewhat something that represent the view that ASEAN should consider taking more on the side of US and also to ask ASEAN to see obviously that China is badly breaking the rule in South China Sea. If the idea is to make US and ASEAN cooperate more, why did we have such a strong message from the Vice President, Ambassador? Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Ambassador Sihasak, should I give a quick answer or should we wait?
No, I think you can address that question now. Thank you.
Okay, it's a good question. I mean, I'm you know, a few thousand miles away from Washington, so I don't have an inside any inside information. I think you know, there's been criticism from Washington of certain China actions. Certainly, there's been plenty of criticism of the United States from Beijing. It's been both ways. But I think the constant message from the United States to the countries of Southeast Asia and ASEAN has been, no, we're not asking you to choose. I think everyone recognizes that Southeast Asian nations do have important relations with China and need to have those good relations. But it doesn't mean that we won't speak out where in a case like the South China Sea, where we find Chinese behavior very concerning, we will still speak out. But my argument was more that there's a lot of cooperation to be done between the United States and Southeast Asia. As I said, health, I certainly agree on the economic and trade piece, absolutely critical to do more on that front. Environment, climate change, all of these areas that aren't necessarily sensitive vis-a-vis China. There's huge opportunities to do more. I think a lot of efforts are already being put into doing more. But I think that should be the focus. United States and Southeast Asia probably won't agree on always on tactics on South China Sea, but I think we are trying to stand up for basic rules of the road. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Of course, we're approaching the time limit that we have, but I think Ambassador Damrong has a question that he'd like to address. Please.
Thank you, Permanent Secretary. Very good morning to our speakers and to everyone. In fact, I really thoroughly enjoy listening to views, remarks, by distinguished speakers. I hope, we could have more time, not just 1.5 hours, but we could have more time to allow you to elaborate on those things you have touched. I was fascinated, by the opening sentence by Ambassador Mahbubani, about what you call the most dangerous geopolitical situation we are facing. This is really the fascinating opening sentence by His Excellency, and all the speakers have touched this issue. But still, one thing that I still ask myself, and I would like to get views from the speakers. We are approaching perhaps in 10 or 15 years, if the situation continues, in which China will be world number one, at least in the economic terms, and that would like change history, the course of history. The U.S. has been number one for almost a century, or roughly a century, but now we're approaching sort of a change of era from the U.S. late world to perhaps China late world. My question is, would the U.S. be prepared to accept that kind of situation? What is the sentiment in Washington D.C. with regard to this question? Are you prepared? If you are not prepared, what is your game plan to block that kind of situation? And if you are prepared to accept it, what the relation or the policy of the U.S. When China is world number one? I'm interested to hear from all the speakers. In fact, I have more questions, but since time is up, I would just limit to this question. Thank you.
Well, anybody would volunteer to be the first speaker? Yes, Ambassador Mahbubani.
By the way, Ambassador Sihasak, I'm also volunteering. Yes. I'm afraid
I have to say that in
I have to excuse myself.
Question, perhaps all of you would like to make your closing remarks as well.
So, sure. And if you don't mind, I'll excuse myself. I have another meeting that begins at 12:30. I decided to stay on, as you know, in this new setting, so I will stay there again. Very quickly, just to answer the question. The question that was posed was a very profound one. Is the United States ready to accept being number 2 position? It's been number 1 for 130 years. And frankly, I would say it's very, very difficult. It's such a very important part of the American culture and psyche to be number 1. And as you know, President Biden himself said, China aspires to be number 1. It ain't gonna happen on my watch. He said that. And I think for any American president to speak about United States becoming number 2 is very, very difficult. And in fact, in my previous book, The Great Convergence, I stroked Talbot at great length. Stroke Talbot, the former Deputy Secretary of State, had conversations with President Bill Clinton saying America should prepare for a world where it's no longer number 1. And Stroke Talbot said it just could not be done. No American president can speak about that. It's very, very difficult. So I think for that reason, I believe we're going to have a difficult decade coming up. But I also want to emphasize, this is my very last point. I think it's very important. We spoke so much about ASEAN. It's very important. I'm sorry to learn from Ambassador, Professor Dr. Surakiat, that the camaraderie that used to be in ASEAN among the leaders, among the foreign ministers has gone down. That's very, very sad. I think APRC should work very hard to rebuild the camaraderie among the ASEAN leaders and ASEAN foreign ministers, because if there's a time when you need ASEAN unity, it is now and today. So let that be the number 1 focus of ASEAN, and I hope that your forum will do that. So with that, I hope you sincerely excuse me. I want to apologize to my fellow panelists, Ambassador Scott Marstial and Professor Dr. Surakiat, and say my apologies that I have to leave you at this point in time. There are other people waiting for me for another meeting.
Yes, thank
Goodbye.
you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for staying on. Thank you. See you again very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Ambassador Marcel, would you like to comment on the question from Ambassador Damrong?
Yeah, it's an interesting question by Ambassador Damrong. I suppose, it's kind of mathematics will determine if and when China's GDP exceeds that of the United States at some point. I certainly take the point that Americans like to be number 1. I'm not sure that GDP figures changing will lead to some dramatic moment where the United States says, okay, we're no longer number 1. I think trying to lead will continue to be very important in the United States. A lot of that, obviously, as President Biden has spoken, is the revitalization of the United States, rebuilding our infrastructure, these sorts of things will continue whether our GDP continues to exceed that of China or does not. And I think we'll continue to see the United States. I mean, the United States isn't going to go out and try to stop the Chinese economy from growing. I mean, we strongly supported China's WTO accession and many other things over the years. I think, though, the United States will continue to emphasize the importance of a rules-based order, as well as freedom and democracy. It's who we are. We're not perfect either, but I think that will continue whether our GDP falls below that of China or not. So I expect the United States to continue to play that kind of leadership role. And I think, continuing to expand its partnership with ASEAN and the members of ASEAN, to again find areas of cooperation and mutual benefit is an important part of that. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador Marcel. So I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Suryakit to address the question posed by Ambassador Damrong. And perhaps as we're nearing the time limit, perhaps Dr. Suryakit, you would like to give some closing remarks on behalf of APRC as well. One final point, those of you who are in the audience, we're doing a survey on the webinar. And so we'd like your evaluation. We have the link for you to evaluate this seminar. Please do so. We thank you for your participation in the survey. Thank you. Dr. Suryakit.
Thank you very much. It's very indeed one of the most difficult things to do is to have concluding remark of all of these distinguished speakers and those of our friends who have made intervention, but I'll try. On the question of Ambassador Damrong, I think it's a very important one. But I think we have to perhaps continue to engage our sides, especially our friends in the United States, that the world ahead, we may not have a single leader in the world. And I'm glad you mentioned that GDP is just a figure. There are other areas that if China overtakes US in terms of the GDP, in fact, China has overtaken US on the PPP already several years ago, purchasing power parity. But there are other areas that US still can lead. US is still number one in military. US can have a more meaningful role politically elsewhere. The social role, the pandemic, global health governance, that's another area that is increasingly important. And US is very advanced in this medical technology. The green economy, and also democracy and human rights. I mean, I think we have to look at the world ahead, not any particular country having a leading role in all issues. There may be some issues that China is advancing. Some of the issues that ASEAN 10 countries, like food security, may be number one in the world. And there are other issues that the United States still leading the world. The question then would be how all of these countries, or groups of countries, can be working together to put all of our leading role together for the betterment of everyone. Just to conclude, I think that I just would like to recap what Kishore, Ambassador Mahbubani mentioned, that the contest is very dangerous, is inevitable, but it's avoidable. I think to see how it can be avoidable, I think we have to look at areas that the US and China can cooperate. And I'm happy to hear that President Biden and President Xi Jinping are talking of more areas that they can cooperate and to manage the relationship well on the areas that they are contesting and on the sensitive areas of each other, especially Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang, and South China Sea. I think the meeting or the seminar has agreed that ASEAN role would have to be strengthened. Like Syed Hamid has said, that the ASEAN role as a peacemaker, as a peace builder, as I said, as a brick, as a regional stabilizer, that has to be strengthened. But it cannot be strengthened in a non-ASEAN fashion. It has to be strengthened in ASEAN fashion. That is the ASEAN way. So the ASEAN way, which we translates into ASEAN diplomacy, would have to be reinvigorated. And I agree with Ambassador Mahbubani that camaraderie among leaders and foreign ministers, including sectoral ministers, would have to be enhanced. Whether APRC can be the one that can play that role, or most of us, the Peace Center at NUS, certain center in Malaysia or elsewhere can work together. That is something that we can perhaps leave it to our future session. It is also agreed that, or the convergence of views, that ASEAN has to act collectively. How can ASEAN act collectively? How can ASEAN be more relevant in resolving ASEAN issues and resolving regional issues, and to bring down tensions between the United States and China in ASEAN? If ASEAN is not strong to resolve its own problems, I cannot see how ASEAN can help US and China having less tension in Southeast Asia or in Asia. And I think ASEAN has to also, on the part of ASEAN, strengthen the engagement with both the United States and China on various areas, on trade, on investment, on monetary system, on financial cooperation, medical cooperation, and green economy cooperation. I think that's probably all that we can conclude from the session. I think there's a convergence of views that the tension is unavoidable, but the tension can be managed. And there are areas that US and China can cooperate in Southeast Asia. And most importantly, I think ASEAN has to play a much bigger role, a much more assertive role, a much more role as a bridge to ensure that ASEAN centrality, ASEAN connectivity is there, and ASEAN can become a peace builder in the area. Thank you, Ambassador Sihasak.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Surakiart, for the concluding remarks. Of course, I don't have anything further to add, but I think today we've really had a very rich discussion on many issues. We know one thing is that 1.5 hours is not enough to discuss all these issues. Perhaps we should have part 2 of this webinar sometime in the near future. But I really like to thank everyone, all the speakers for their contribution. Ambassador Scott Marcel, thank you. I think it's a little bit late in California right now. I'm sorry. Perhaps it's dinner time at the moment. But thank you very much for joining us. And I would like to thank Ambassador Kishore Mahbubani, thank Professor Dr. Surakiart, our chairman. Thank the council members, Excellency Tinley, Excellency Tansi Syed Hamid. Thank Secretary General Sarajak, and especially to thank everyone who are joining us in the audience. And thank you very much. And hopefully we can do this again in the near future. ขอบคุณครับ Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye bye. Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye, Ambassador Marcel. Prime Minister. Bye bye.
Bye.